If you ask most people to name a powerful queen from history, you'll probably hear the same handful of names. Elizabeth I, Cleopatra, maybe Catherine the Great if they're feeling ambitious. But what about the queens whose stories have slipped through the cracks of time? The women who shaped kingdoms, toppled dynasties, and changed the course of history, yet whose names rarely make it into textbooks or Netflix dramas. Today, we're diving into the world of the forgotten queens, the rulers, regents, and rebels who wielded power in ways that still echo centuries later, even if you've never heard their names. Let's start with a question. Why do some queens become legends, while others fade into obscurity? Is it because their stories weren't dramatic enough? Hardly. In fact, some of the most jaw-dropping tales in medieval and ancient history belong to women whose names you probably don't know. Sometimes, it's simply a matter of who wrote the history books and who got left out. But if you look closer, you'll find that these forgotten queens were anything but ordinary. They were survivors, strategists, and sometimes outright revolutionaries. 1. Queen Njinga of Ndongo and Matamba. Born in what is now Angola in the late 16th century, Queen Njinga was never supposed to rule. Her brother was king, and her role was supposed to be limited to diplomacy and support. But when the Portuguese invaded, everything changed. Njinga didn't just negotiate with the invaders, she outsmarted them at every turn. She learned their language, studied their tactics, and even converted to Christianity to gain their trust. But behind the scenes, she was building alliances, training armies, and plotting her next move. When her brother died, Njinga seized the throne, defying tradition and her rivals. She ruled for nearly 40 years, leading her people through war, famine, and betrayal. She even led her troops into battle herself, riding at the front lines in full armor. Her enemies called her ruthless. Her people called her a savior, and yet, outside of Angola, her name is barely a whisper. 2. Empress Matilda of England. Contrast that with the story of Empress Matilda, the woman who almost became England's first queen regnant. Born in 1102, Matilda was the daughter of King Henry IV and the designated heir to the English throne. But when her father died, her cousin Stephen seized power, plunging England into a brutal civil war known as the Anarchy. For nearly 2 decades, Matilda fought to reclaim her birthright. She led armies, survived sieges, and outmaneuvered her enemies in a world that refused to accept a woman as king. At one point, she famously escaped a besieged castle by disguising herself in white and slipping past enemy lines in the dead of winter. Though she never wore the crown herself, her persistence paved the way for her son, Henry II, to become one of England's greatest kings. Without Matilda, there would be no Plantagenet dynasty, no Eleanor of Aquitaine, no Richard the Lionheart. Yet her name is often overshadowed by the men who followed her. 3. Empress Suiko of Japan. But let's not just focus on Europe. The world is full of forgotten queens whose stories deserve to be told. In 7th century Japan, Empress Suiko became the first woman to officially rule as Empress Regnant. She presided over a period of profound change, introducing Buddhism to the Japanese court and overseeing the creation of the country's first constitution. Her reign was marked by peace, prosperity, and cultural transformation. Yet in most histories of Japan, her name is a footnote at best. 4. Queen Tamar of Georgia, or consider Queen Tamar of Georgia, who ruled in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Tamar inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse, surrounded by hostile neighbors and plagued by internal strife. But through sheer force of will and a knack for picking the right allies, she turned Georgia into a regional superpower. Under her rule, the country experienced a golden age of art, literature, and military conquest. Tamar led her armies to victory against invaders, expanded her territory, and became so beloved that she was later canonized as a saint. In Georgia, she's a national hero. Elsewhere, she's barely mentioned. What unites these women isn't just their power, but the way they wielded it. They didn't just inherit thrones, they fought for them, defended them, and transformed them. They navigated treacherous courts, outsmarted rivals, and made decisions that shaped the destinies of entire nations. And yet, for every Njinga, Matilda, Suiko, or Tamar, there are dozens more whose stories have been lost to time. Why does this happen? Part of it is the way history has been recorded. For centuries, chroniclers and historians were overwhelmingly male, and their priorities shaped the stories that survived. Women's achievements were often downplayed, dismissed, or attributed to the men around them. Even when queens were acknowledged, they were often portrayed as pawns or consorts, rather than as rulers in their own right. But there's another reason too. Power, when wielded by women, has always been seen as a threat to the status quo. Queens who broke the mold, who led armies, made laws, or defied tradition, were often painted as dangerous, unnatural, or even evil. Their successes were minimized, their failures magnified. Over time, their stories faded, replaced by more acceptable narratives. Yet, if you dig beneath the surface, you'll find that these forgotten queens left indelible marks on history. Their decisions shaped borders, influenced religions, and changed the lives of millions. Some ruled with iron fists, others with diplomacy and cunning. Some were beloved, others feared. But all of them proved that leadership isn't defined by gender. It's defined by vision, courage, and the willingness to defy expectations. So, as we journey through the lives of these remarkable women, keep one thing in mind. History isn't just what's written in the books. It's the stories we choose to remember and the ones we choose to forget. Today, we're choosing to remember the queens who changed history forever, even if the world forgot their names. If you think the story of forgotten queens is just about royal intrigue and palace drama, think again. Many of these women were forced to become political chess masters, not by choice, but by necessity. Their worlds were often violent, unpredictable, and deeply suspicious of female authority. Yet, time and again, they found ways to turn the rules of the game to their advantage. 5. Queen Sobekneferu of Egypt. Consider the case of Queen Sobekneferu, who ruled Egypt nearly 1,800 years before Cleopatra. When her brother died without an heir, Sobekneferu stepped into a power vacuum that could have torn Egypt apart. She didn't just claim the throne, she redefined what it meant to be a pharaoh. Sobekneferu adopted both male and female regalia, blending traditional symbols of kingship with her own identity. She commissioned temples, expanded trade, and stabilized the kingdom during a period of crisis. Her reign was short, but it set a precedent for female leadership in Egypt. Yet, when most people think of Egyptian queens, her name is rarely mentioned. It's a reminder that even the first to break barriers can be overshadowed by those who come later. 6. Queen Berengaria of Navarre now. Let's travel to medieval France, where another queen's story has been largely erased. Berengaria of Navarre was the wife of Richard the Lionheart, one of England's most famous kings. But while Richard was off fighting in the Crusades, Berengaria was left to navigate the treacherous politics of Europe alone. She managed estates, negotiated with rival nobles, and even secured her own safety in a world where royal widows were often seen as pawns to be married off or discarded. Despite her intelligence and resilience, Berengaria's story is often reduced to a footnote in Richard's legend. Yet, without her careful diplomacy, the Plantagenet dynasty might have crumbled. 7. Queen Shajar al-Dur of Egypt. Contrast that with the story of Queen Shajar al-Dur, who rose from slavery to become the Sultana of Egypt in the 13th century. Shajar al-Dur's ascent was nothing short of extraordinary. Originally a concubine, she became the wife of Sultan al-Salih Ayyub. When he died during the Seventh Crusade, she concealed his death to maintain stability, orchestrated the defense of Cairo, and ultimately took the throne herself. For a brief period, she ruled Egypt in her own name. issuing coins and decrees as sultana. Her reign was controversial, and she faced fierce opposition from both the military elite and religious authorities. But her leadership during a time of crisis helped repel the Crusaders and preserve the Ayyubid dynasty. Shajar al-Durr's story is a testament to the power of resilience and adaptability, even in the face of overwhelming odds. 8. Blanche of Castile, but not all forgotten queens ruled from thrones of gold. Some led from the shadows, wielding influence behind the scenes. Take Blanche of Castile, the mother of King Louis IX of France. When her husband died, Blanche became regent for her young son. She faced rebellions, invasions, and constant threats to her authority. Yet, through a combination of shrewd alliances and sheer determination, she held the kingdom together until Louis came of age. Blanche's political acumen was so respected that even her enemies acknowledged her as the true power behind the throne. Still, her legacy is often overshadowed by her son's sainthood. 9. Rani Durgavati of India. Let's not forget the queens who changed history not by ruling, but by resisting. In 16th century India, Rani Durgavati became a symbol of defiance against the Mughal Empire. When her kingdom was threatened, she led her troops into battle, refusing to surrender even when outnumbered. Her courage inspired generations, and her story is still celebrated in parts of India today. Yet, outside her homeland, she remains largely unknown. What's striking about these stories is how often these women were forced to walk a tightrope between power and peril. For every queen who succeeded, there were countless others who paid a heavy price for their ambition. Some were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Others were erased from official records, their achievements attributed to male relatives or rivals. The risks were immense, but so were the rewards. When these women succeeded, they didn't just secure their own legacies. They changed the destinies of entire nations. But why do their stories matter today? It's easy to dismiss the past as a world of kings and conquerors where women's voices were silenced. Yet, the truth is far more complex. These forgotten queens remind us that history is not a straight line. It's a tapestry woven from countless threads, many of which have been deliberately snipped or hidden. By rediscovering their stories, we gain a fuller, richer understanding of the past and of the present. There's also a lesson here about the nature of power itself. The queens we've met so far didn't always have armies at their command or crowns on their heads. Sometimes, their greatest strength was their ability to adapt, to outthink their enemies, and to turn adversity into opportunity. They remind us that leadership isn't just about titles or bloodlines, it's about vision, courage, and the willingness to challenge the status quo. As we move forward, let's look at how these forgotten queens have inspired new generations. In recent years, historians and writers have begun to reclaim their stories, shining a light on the women who shaped history from the shadows. Novels, documentaries, and even video games are starting to feature these queens as complex, multidimensional characters, not just as wives or mothers, but as leaders in their own right. Yet, there's still work to be done. For every Njinga or Tamar who is finally getting her due, there are dozens more whose stories remain untold. The challenge for us is to keep searching, to keep asking questions, and to keep challenging the narratives that have shaped our understanding of the past. So, the next time you hear someone say that history is just a list of kings and battles, remember the forgotten queens. Remember the women who ruled, who fought, who survived, and who changed the world, even if the world forgot their names. As we reach the last chapter of our journey through the lives of forgotten queens, let's pause and consider what it really means to be forgotten. Is it simply a matter of being left out of the history books? Or is it something deeper? A kind of collective amnesia that shapes how we see the world and ourselves? The truth is, the stories we choose to remember say as much about us as they do about the past. And when we overlook the women who shaped history, we lose not just their stories, but the lessons they have to teach us. Let's return to the idea of contrast. For every queen who was celebrated in her own time, there were others who were deliberately erased. Sometimes this erasure was political. When a new dynasty took power, it was common to destroy the records of previous rulers, especially if those rulers were women who had challenged the status quo. Other times, the erasure was cultural. In societies where women's authority was seen as unnatural or dangerous, their achievements were downplayed or attributed to men. Even today, the legacy of this erasure lingers. How many of us can name more than a handful of queens who ruled in their own right, rather than as consorts or regents? But the tide is turning. In recent years, a new generation of historians, writers, and creators has begun to reclaim the stories of these forgotten queens. They're digging through archives, translating ancient texts, and piecing together fragments of lost histories. They're asking new questions. What did it mean to be a woman in power? How did these queens navigate the challenges of their time? And what can we learn from their successes and their failures? 10. Queen Amina of Zazzau. Take, for example, Queen Amina of Zazzau, a 16th century ruler in what is now Nigeria. Amina was a warrior queen, famous for her military campaigns and her expansion of the kingdom's territory. She built walls around cities, established trade routes, and led her armies into battle. Her reign brought prosperity and security to her people, and her legend lives on in Nigerian folklore. Yet, for centuries, her story was passed down only through oral tradition, ignored by official histories. It's only in recent decades that historians have begun to recognize her as one of Africa's greatest rulers. 11. Queen Margaret I of Denmark, or consider Queen Margaret I of Denmark, who in the late 14th century united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under a single crown, a feat no man had accomplished before her. Margaret was a master diplomat, skilled at balancing the competing interests of powerful nobles and foreign rivals. She ruled with a steady hand, bringing peace and stability to a region long plagued by conflict. Yet, her achievements were often overshadowed by the kings who followed her, and her name is still unfamiliar to many outside Scandinavia. These stories matter not just because they fill gaps in our knowledge, but because they challenge the narratives we've inherited. They remind us that history is not a fixed story, but a living conversation, one that we all have a stake in shaping. When we remember the forgotten queens, we're not just honoring their legacies, we're expanding our understanding of what's possible. And it's not just about the past. The lessons of these queens are as relevant today as they were centuries ago. In a world where women still face barriers to leadership, where their achievements are often minimized or ignored, the stories of Queen Njinga, Empress Matilda, Empress Suiko, Queen Tamar, Queen Sobekneferu, Queen Berengaria, Queen Shajar al-Dur, Blanche of Castile, Rani Durgavati, Queen Amina, Queen Margaret, and so many others offer both inspiration and caution. They show us that progress is possible but never guaranteed, that power can be won, but it must also be defended. That leadership is not about fitting into someone else's mold, but about forging your own path, even when the world tells you it can't be done. So, what can we take away from the lives of these forgotten queens? First, that history is richer and more complex than we often realize. The past is not just a parade of kings and conquerors, but a tapestry woven from the lives of countless individuals, many of whom have been overlooked or erased. Second, that the struggle for recognition and equality is not new. For centuries, women have fought for the right to lead, to be heard, and to shape their own destinies. Their victories and defeats are part of a larger story, one that continues to this day. Finally, we're reminded that the act of remembering is itself a form of power. By telling these stories, by sharing them with others, we help to restore what was lost. We give voice to those who were silenced, and we challenge the narratives that have shaped our understanding of the world. In doing so, we not only honor the forgotten queens of history, we also create space for new stories, new voices, and new possibilities. As we close this chapter, Imagine for a moment what history might look like if the stories of these queens had been told all along. How might our understanding of leadership, power, and possibility be different? What lessons might we have learned sooner? And what new stories are waiting to be discovered just beneath the surface of the past? The next time you walk through a museum, read a history book, or watch a documentary, remember to look for the stories that aren't being told. Ask yourself, whose voices are missing? Whose achievements have been overlooked? And what can we do to bring them back into the light? Because history is not just about the past, it's about the future we choose to build. And the forgotten queens who changed history forever are a reminder that even the most powerful stories can be lost unless we choose to remember them.